and Search True North. This week, we are going to talk about Iran. This episode is being prompted by the recent assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, a scientist in Iran. But the issue is one that's been going on for decades, and that both Zach and I have become increasingly interested in. So,
say that, Coach? Can you repeat that?
Mohsen Fakhrizadeh.
Fakhrizadeh. I'm going to be saying it the whole podcast, so I want to make sure that we say it right. So,
for whatever it's worth, even the highest leaders of the U.S. government still call Iran and Iraq Iran and Iraq. So the threshold for getting this right is pretty low.
I wonder to what extent all that stuff's on purpose.
Yeah, I wonder the same thing sometimes. But I saw a YouTube video with one of those guys who just travels the world and makes videos about this is what happened to me in this country, and he went to Iran, and it's funny and cute, but also kind of sad how many comments there were from Iranians who were overjoyed that somebody from the West pronounced the name of their country correctly.
That's great.
It's not even hard. It's not like Fakhrizadeh is kind of a intimidating looking name, but Iran is not difficult to say.
No, not at all. I mean, I think it's important to we're already off on a tangent. Good Lord. It's important to educate people, not get upset at them. It's 2020. Absolutely. There's no, don't call people racist for saying Iraq. Just politely clarify that Iraq. So
yeah. Anyway, so Fakhrizadeh was gunned down while he was driving on a highway in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran. And it's interesting. So a lot of this episode is going to be us reviewing what's being said in the mainstream media, not just about Fakhrizadeh, but also about Iran, and then walking that back and explaining what's actually going on. So in the mainstream media, what we're being told is that Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was basically the analog to he's like the Oppenheimer of Iran, is what they're saying. What Oppenheimer was to the Manhattan Project, they're saying Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was to Iran's quote nuclear weapons program. What's the truth of the matter is, though, so first of all, let's walk back the biggest nugget of propagandized misinformation. Iran has no nuclear weapons program. The U.S. and Israel have never provided any concrete evidence that Iran actually has a nuclear weapons program. Furthermore, Iran has complied with UN inspections, and UN inspectors have consistently found that not only is Iran's nuclear program not for military purposes, it's entirely for energy and research purposes, but they found that Iran's nuclear program is entirely in accordance with the Nuclear Non-proliferation Treaty that all sorts of countries have signed. So this idea that Iran has a nuclear weapons program is basically accepted as fact in the West just because it is repeated over and over and over again by politicians and by mainstream media outlets. So that's the first thing that everybody needs to know. Also, it's kind of common sense that if Iran did have a nuclear weapons program, who was it? Scott Ritter, who was a former UN weapons inspector and also a former Marine Corps intelligence officer, he put it really well. He said, if Iran did have a nuclear weapons program, we wouldn't be talking about escalating tensions between Iran, Israel, and the US. We would be talking about the war that's already underway. But what we've seen for decades is a more measured, gradual, tit for tat kind of a game of cat and mouse or something like that. That really indicates that both Israel and the US know that Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program. But instead, what's going on is Israel and the US, I think that there's one of two possible scenarios. Either they object to Iran having any uranium enrichment program, really, because they fear that it's a slippery slope and that eventually, if Iran develops the technology to enrich uranium domestically, that it would not be very difficult for Iran eventually to pivot and redesign that process, that program, to enrich uranium for the sake of developing a nuclear weapon. So they are knowing full well that Iran does not currently have a nuclear weapons program and never has had a nuclear weapons program. They might be attacking Iran in these small tit-for-tat instances in an attempt to totally sabotage Iran's nuclear ability before it has the potential to ever become weaponized. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that they just hate Iran because Iran has successfully defied the unipolar will of the United States and its allies since 1979, when they overthrew the Shah. And the US and its allies have had a long history of basically zero tolerance for defiance to their geopolitical and economic agendas. So which of those two is true? I don't know. But so the big thing right away, Iran has no nuclear weapons program. The second thing is Iran's nuclear program that is for energy production and for medical research. While that does exist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the recently assassinated scientist, forgive me for how long that tangent, well, not tangent, but how long that first explanation was.
It's relative.
Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was not some sort of key mastermind behind their nuclear program. He was a physicist. He had a PhD and he taught at the University of Tehran. And I've heard two accounts that aren't entirely in line with each other, but they complement each other pretty well. Professor Mohammad Marandi, also of the University of Tehran, who knew Fakhrizadeh, he said that Fakhrizadeh was basically a manager who helped get Iran's nuclear energy program started. Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector and former Marine Corps intelligence officer, he said that basically Fakhrizadeh was tapped by the university that began Iran's nuclear program to basically act as a procurement official. So they had these ambitions to start enriching uranium for energy production, but they knew that Israel and the US would not allow them to openly procure the materials necessary to begin domestically enriching uranium. So they realized that they would have to covertly procure all of these materials. Fakhrizadeh was the lead on that program between 1998 and 2003, but was not directly involved with the program beyond that. That's what Scott Ritter claimed. So he helped get the materials to get this program started, but he was not some sort of mastermind. And not only that, but he wasn't very actively relevant to the program now that it's established. In fact, Professor Morandi actually said, he said 10 to 15 years ago, Fakhrizadeh's death would have had a big impact. But now the uranium enrichment program is more developed, so his assassination is more of a symbolic blow against Iran than it is a strategic or tactical blow. So those are the two big things right off the bat that the mainstream media is totally getting wrong. Probably intentionally. The nuclear program one, definitely. And I think what they're trying to do is they're really, it's interesting because if you want to covertly dismantle Iran's uranium enrichment program, then why, if that was your only goal, then why would you talk about it so openly? Why would you talk about Fakhrizadeh? Why would you talk about his death? And why would you amplify his significance within the Iranian government and within the uranium enrichment program? I think what's going on in the West is they're basically trying to make this attack seem like as big of a deal as possible. And it is a really big deal. People over there are pissed. Fakhrizadeh is considered a national hero, a celebrated intellectual who's made major contributions to the country. So I don't mean to downplay it, but the West in the media and, the way politicians are talking about it, they are grossly misrepresenting what's going on. And I think what they're trying to do is they're really trying to goad Iran into attacking Israel or the United States. Or if Iran doesn't fully retaliate in a commensurate way, which it's kind of not likely to, at least based on past precedent, then what the US and Israel are hoping is that this act will make the Iranian government look weak and incompetent to the whole world, but most especially to Iran's own people and to anyone around Iran, different groups of people around Iran who might want to attempt to destabilize Iran. That's kind of my take of what's going on.
How long have we been going there? That was a long monologue, Cody. But it was good. It was really informative. A lot of things don't, like you mentioned, a lot of things just don't make sense.
Yeah.
Like you can argue this with any country that we're in. It's like, why are we there? Like, are we getting something from Iran? Are we getting oil? Are we getting something that they are rich in? Do you know if that's the case? Like, are we getting something are we getting something from them, or is this just simply a power play that the United States, like, they want a monopoly on nuclear weapons, and they think that maybe a nuclear program could lead to that, so we might as well take out this guy and claim that he's more important to their nuclear weapons program than he actually is?
I don't know. I suspect that the answer is multifaceted. Scott Ritter had said that he doesn't believe that the answer is that the U.S. and Israel just generally want to hurt Iran. He said Israel and the United States have made it clear in the past that they are okay with Iran having nuclear energy as long as the uranium isn't enriched domestically. So they can import enriched uranium from other countries. But the United States and Israel don't want Iran to have the technology and the processes in place to enrich it domestically. So that's what he said. But to me, if you look back at the history of Iran's relationships with the United States before it even had a uranium enrichment program, it's been antagonistic for decades. It's been antagonistic ever since we overthrew the Shah in 1979. I think most egregiously, we built up Saddam Hussein, going so far as to supply him with chemical weapons, including sarin gas and mustard gas, and basically giving him carte blanche to use chemical weapons against Iran and the proxy war that was fought between Iran and Iraq in the late 80s. And we also went so far as to, during that war, when we were supplying Saddam Hussein with chemical weapons to use against the Iranian people, knowing full well that he was going to use them against civilians, and really not batting an eye when he did, even though the Iranian government quite shrewdly was actually sending victims of these chemical attacks to hospitals in Europe in an attempt to raise awareness of what the heinous war crimes that Saddam Hussein was perpetrating. But nevertheless, nobody really cared in the West. The media really didn't talk about it. And at the same time that was going on, the United States was issuing sanctions to block Iran from even importing gas masks to protect themselves. So in order to protect themselves from the ongoing chemical weapon attacks from Saddam Hussein, they actually had to smuggle gas masks in from countries that have a more adversarial relationship with the United States. I don't remember particularly which countries, but I think it was China or North Korea or Russia, one of those. Yeah. So to your question, I think Israel and the United States are uncomfortable with Iran having the capability to enrich uranium domestically. Scott Ritter was very confident of that, and he seemed like a pretty reliable source. But at the same time, I think the deep psychotic level of murderous antagonism from the United States and from Israel, it goes back decades. It predates Iran's uranium enrichment program by almost 20 years. So to me, it really just seems like the United States, as we've seen in many other instances, the United States will not tolerate any country standing up to it and defying its will. The United States views itself as the unipolar force, or the unipolar geopolitical force in the modern world. It sees itself as the exceptionalist America, the sole superpower, and that has the right to police the whole world per its agenda. Iran defied the U.S.'s will when it overthrew the Shah in 1979. And it didn't help, too, that it kept, I want to say it was 52 hostages that I believe it took from the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Or maybe it was 40. I forget. It was like between 40 and 50 hostages that it held for some amount of time, from the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency to the beginning of the Reagan presidency. And ever since then, we've had an intensely antagonistic relationship with Iran. We've levied sanctions against them for decades. The Clinton administration actually almost launched a full-scale invasion against Iran over allegations that Iran was behind an attack on the Khobar Towers. I believe that the Khobar Towers were in Saudi Arabia, one of the countries over in the Gulf. But there were something like 19 United States airmen, I believe, who were killed in the attack on the Khobar Towers. and Clinton, his administration. Sorry, I'm searching through my notes.
Very good.
Yeah, so I was more apologizing to our listeners. So Osama,
how many were you up to now?
Hopefully 6. Or maybe we lost a few. But so yeah, the Khobar Tower attacks were in Saudi Arabia in 1996. 19 U.S. airmen were killed in the attacks, and Clinton apparently said to his counterterrorism advisor that if Iran was responsible, he didn't want any, quote, pissant half measures. And all the,
it's like a Hillary quote.
Yeah. And all of the different options that the Pentagon considered, it actually drew up plans for a full ground invasion. And the Pentagon did all this at the behest of the Clinton administration, despite the fact that Osama bin Laden publicly claimed responsibility for those attacks. So I'm probably kind of rambling by now, but basically, I think it's twofold. I think the uranium enrichment program is a convenient excuse. I think that the history indicates that the U.S. and Israel are just generally hostile towards Iran. But I do think Israel and the U.S. also are uncomfortable with Iran developing a skillful capability in uranium enrichment that could potentially in the future be dedicated towards development of a nuclear weapon. And then I would say lastly, the U.S. uses Iran as something kind of like it used Russia in the Cold War, where building up Russia and the psyche of the American people to justify the Vietnam War, the Korean War, all of the military adventurism that the Reagan and Bush administrations undertook in Central and South America. Basically, the U.S. government has built Iran up to justify the same sort of military adventurism in the Middle East. So most of the United States military agenda is actually justified in the Middle East specifically, is actually justified by the illusory threat of this Iranian boogeyman.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. A thought did cross my mind. How much of a tinfoil hat am I allowed on this show? It's not necessarily tinfoil hat so much. So I'm just gonna say it. But if we want to look at some motivations behind the United States entering the Middle East, which we've been for decades now, but if you look back at 2000, several Middle Eastern countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Iran, Iraq.
Yeah,
sorry, I've been just my whole life is just Iraq, Iran, Sudan, Libya. None of them had central banking systems. So when you think about the United States motivation behind even being there in the first place, it probably to get a central bank established. It is at least in part behind the motivation. Now, I guess I'll leave out to your imagination who's behind that, but but for real, I mean, and they're not listed anymore as countries with no central bank. So they've had some established since 2000. Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran. So anyway, take that as you will. Any thoughts on that? Because I think that's really interesting.
I think that is interesting. I don't have any thoughts on that I can confidently ground in hard, factual evidence.
Yeah, that's the problem with with your tinfoil hat is it's oftentimes it's not, you're not able to ground it in any sort of evidence. That's why it's so speculatory, like why we're there in the first place.
The really big thing that we need to talk about with what's going on right now in Iran is how this is part of an ongoing campaign of aggression against Iran by Israel and the United States, and what that means for the future. And what's really kind of freaking me out is, let me just screen share this moment. Share screen. So this is the Daily Beast. They're not the, in my opinion, I don't know a lot about them, but the people that I really like and trust don't have the best opinion of them. So I don't know. I can take it with a grain of salt, I guess. But this is what the Daily Beast is reporting. Business Insider had a very similar article. Trump tells Pompeo, go wild on Iran. Just don't risk World War III. Basically, what the article says is that Trump has checked out on the issue because he's so worried about his election lawsuits, and he's told Pompeo, do whatever you want. And the way that the media is covering this basically is that Biden wants to return to the JCPOA. The JCPOA, for the 90% of people who had no idea what that was previously, myself included, it's the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It was a treaty that was brokered between the Obama administration and Iran in 2015. My understanding of the basic terms of the agreement is that Iran agreed that it would stop enriching uranium to 20%, which is the level of enrichment required to produce a nuclear weapon. They were using it for research purposes, to be clear. They were creating medical isotopes, is what Scott Ritter had said. So,
are they also using it for energy?
Well, you only have to enrich uranium to about 3 or 4% to be used for energy production.
Okay.
And so that everyone on the program knows, the reason that Iran is so adamant about energy production, by the way, is that basically they want to take themselves entirely off of oil so that they can export 100% of the oil that they produce, so that they can grow their economy more aggressively. So, yeah, the JCPOA, basically that was what Iran said. They said, hey, we're willing to stop enriching uranium to 20%. And in exchange, the Obama administration was supposed to reduce some of the sanctions against Iran. I think in particular, Europe was supposed to be allowed to trade with Iran after that. The United States, from the very beginning, was not a good faith actor in this deal. There were still sanctions against Iran after the deal was signed. And ultimately in 2018, Trump took the U.S. out of the deal. So Trump backed the U.S. out of the deal entirely. He said, well, it was a bad deal. And what's crazy is Iran is actually still upholding some of the deal, or it was until Fakhrizadeh was assassinated. So we're 2 years after Trump pulled out of the deal, and then we assassinate. Well, nobody's taking credit for it. It might have been Israel or the U.S. or Saudi Arabia. Who knows? But basically, for 2 years, Iran has not been enriching uranium to 20% per the terms of the JCPOA. And after the assassination of Fakhrizadeh, Iran said that it was going to start enriching to 20% again. So Iran has been very patient and level-headed and rational through this whole thing, and just said, oh my God, what do we have to do to get you to treat us like an ordinary country? And they've tried time and time again to work with the United States. In fact, after 9/11, Iran actually helped the United States fight back Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, because Iran is generally pretty hostile towards radical terrorist groups. They feel that they destabilize the region that it exists in. So when the U.S. announced that it was going to go to war against Al-Qaeda, Iran said, "Hey, we'll help you." At the same time that they were helping the United States fight Al-Qaeda, George W. Bush called Iran, and on television for the whole world to hear, he called Iran part of the axis of evil, which is intentionally crafted to bring back all of these World War II images of Hitler and Tojo and Mussolini. Yeah, exactly. Yep. So like Iran was actually making this good faith gesture to try to improve its relationship with the United States, saying, "Hey, we don't like Al-Qaeda either. We'll help you fight them." And then the Bush administration actually implied that Iran was an ally, not just to Al-Qaeda, but to Muslim extremist terrorism throughout the world. So this is sort of the weird damned if you do, damned if you don't situation that Iran has found itself in for a while. And yeah, so
I don't think there's really no winning with the United States. I mean, it's kind of like you come to an agreement and then the United States just squeezes you as much as they possibly can out of stuff. So you're trying to be a rational person. You think that when you make a deal with the United States, you're like, oh, they'll uphold their end of the deal. And then they proceed to drop bombs on you for excessive amounts of time. So
well, and the United States has become so creative in its multifaceted regime change strategies. Basically, the United States will levy sanctions. The United States also will try to inspire the people of your country to rise up against their own government, which the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Europe, and I think Qatar. I'm a little fuzzy on the last one, but all of these NATO-aligned countries are actively investing in Persian-speaking media outlets within Iran, basically to try to radicalize the Iranian people against their own government, constantly telling them that their government's incompetent and dishonest, which there are analogs to that. I mean, that's not unheard of. Russia definitely does that in the U.S. with RT, though I will say, I think as far as how it reports on the United States government, I think RT does a much better, more honest job reporting on the U.S. government than the domestic United States news organizations do. But my point is there's tons of news organizations in Iran that are funded and managed by the United States, by Israel, by Europe, by Saudi Arabia, to try to just get the Iranian people themselves to overthrow the government. If that doesn't work, the United States and Israel will launch propaganda campaigns to try to make any of their adversaries appear as though they're hostile threats to their own existence, like what we saw with George W. Bush in Iraq in 2003. And if that doesn't work, we can also have leaders assassinated. Like I think what we've seen the most in Iran is long-standing, multi-decade sanctions. And it's so interesting because what we're sold in America is that sanctions can be targeted, that you can levy sanctions against a country, and somehow these sanctions are only going to affect the political elite of the country. That is not what they're fucking doing, and we goddamn know it. What we're doing is we're trying to make the people of those countries outraged and desperate. We're trying to make them so angry that they will come together to try to overthrow their domestic government. That is the purpose of sanctions. Because the most wealthy and politically connected people of a country usually aren't really affected by sanctions. They're usually pretty insulated by it. It's to it's to radicalize the masses. And the sanctions in Iran are so extreme that Iran struggles to even get the flu vaccine into its country.
Yeah, that's affecting the people, not the political elite of Iran.
Iran can barely get insulin into its country. So like people are dying. Like, and it's so funny because sanctions are a fucking act of war. And you see people, especially more carefully crafted diplomats like Obama, present sanctions as though they're these sort of like non-violent diplomatic geopolitical solutions. But no, sanctions fucking kill people. People are dying in Iran because of the sanctions that the U.S. has levied against them. And the U.S. has actually levied secondary sanctions against any or threatened secondary sanctions against any European country that dares defy the U.S. by trading with Iran.
Yeah, and very eloquent and practiced politicians will always portray them as like, well, we didn't want to do this, but Iran, they just forced our hand. We just have to do this.
The reluctant warrior trope.
Yeah, the reluctant warrior. I mean, that's what Obama touted for 8 years. He was the reluctant warrior. I don't want to go to war with this country. I don't want to put sanctions on them, but it's just what you got to do. And we can see that with excerpts from his new book, but we won't get into that today.
Oh my god, yeah.
But it is interesting that we do levy sanctions, and your point is so well made, is that it never affects the political elite. If someone levied sanctions, if China levied sanctions against us, who would that hurt? It would hurt the people. I mean, it would, we can't get whatever from China that we're levying sanctions for, or we can't export. People can't send stuff to and from China. The political elite don't care, but the people who are buying and selling from China do care. Like those are people, the citizens that are affected. So,
the earlier you had asked, a bit about what was really going on with the United States agenda with Iran. Investigative journalist Gareth Porter, who's actually written, he's kind of an expert on Middle Eastern affairs for the United States, and he's actually written an entire book about the U.S.'s alarmism about Iran's uranium enrichment program called, Manufactured Crisis. So he was interviewed by the Gray Zone, and he said the U.S. cannot have normalized peaceful relations with Iran for 3 major reasons. And I kind of touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to go more in depth because I think this is fascinating. So portraying Iran as some sort of ultimate bad actor that covertly sponsors terrorism and aspires for nuclear weaponry justifies the U.S.'s aggressive presence throughout the Middle East. And the first thing, and I think that this is actually a pretty big point, portraying Iran in this way justifies the multi-billion-dollar arms deals that the military-industrial complex makes with Middle Eastern countries that are opposed to Iran. The most notable of which being the 2017 deal with Saudi Arabia, which it's one of many arms deals with Middle Eastern countries that the U.S. military-industrial complex has engaged in. But that one deal alone that Trump brokered resulted in $110 billion worth of military equipment being sold to Saudi Arabia immediately, and $350 billion worth of equipment sold over the next 10 years. And
that's where that $720 billion military budget is going, by the way.
Yeah.
Just so everyone knows that
I think
$110 billion of it went to give arms to Saudi Arabia. So.
No, that's the thing. I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure that that's actually money coming into the U.S. from Saudi Arabia. So that's additional revenue for the military-industrial complex on top of the Pentagon's domestic budget. So Saudi Arabia is actually
Yeah.
giving the
Okay.
U.S. military-industrial complex almost $500 billion.
Sorry, I don't want to go on a tangent here, but I venture to say at least some of that 110 was paid to the companies of, that $720 billion that approved. I mean, they give that to these companies, right? So that
No, yeah,
110
in
is
that
just kind of
case,
like
yeah.
it's sort of like paying the United States whatever they already paid these military companies to make the arms, and now they're just getting like their end of the deal on it. If that makes sense.
I don't think I don't know if I'm misunderstanding you, but I think that those are separate transactions. The United States government pays for whatever portion of the 720, well, really closer to $1 trillion that the United States government spends every year on the military. Whatever portion of that is used to buy equipment from the military-industrial complex, that is a separate purchase. The military-industrial complex is allowed to have multiple customers, and then the United States government acts as an intermediary to broker those deals between Raytheon and Boeing and Northrop Grumman and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I'm getting. Okay. Anyway, all right.
I could be mistaken. Wait, so what you're saying is that the United States government purchases that military equipment from the MIC and then resells it to Saudi Arabia after purchasing it? Is that what you're implying?
No. So what I'm saying is that it's like I'm saying exactly what you said about the United States manufacturing a deal, right? So Saudi Arabia comes to our government and says, "Hey, we need weapons." The U.S. is like, "Hey, I got you." So they take a portion of that 720 billion. They pay the military industrial, the MIC companies that we use, that 720 billion dollars goes to paying them to make stuff, and then the U.S. government brokers that deal. So we ship the stuff over to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia pays the government. The government makes the money back that we paid our military, the MIC company, to make in the first place. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure.
Our money. We're getting our money back, is what I'm saying.
I don't think we, as in the government, are. I think that the MIC, like if the government's expenditures for military, say that it was the entire defense budget, which it's not, but let's say that it was the $724 billion or something like that. I think like if you take this 2017 deal with Saudi Arabia for $110 billion worth of arms sold immediately, I think that means that net, it's not 110 billion out of the 720, it's 830 billion being purchased from the MIC. Is that what you're saying, or am I misunderstanding you?
No.
And I could be wrong. I don't know how. I don't know the mechanics of all this, but I think my gut instinct would be that that's how it works.
Okay. Yeah, I don't either. That's why I asked. We're here. I'm here to learn. So
I remember when Trump actually brokered this deal, he bragged about it and said that he was helping the economy so much by selling the fucking war machinery to one of the most hostile regimes in the Middle East, like a regime that we know for a fact was arming and funding ISIS. Trump's like, "Hey, it's so great for the economy. I sold them the largest arms deal in the history of our country." No sense of irony about that at all.
No, not at all.
So the point that Porter, the investigative journalist, was making, he said that there were 3 reasons why the United States can never have peaceful, or at least not anytime soon, have peaceful, normalized relations with Iran. The first is that it's very, very lucrative for United States corporations for the United States government to have this deeply antagonistic relationship with Iran, because portraying Iran as this big bad boogeyman of Islamic extremism. It justifies the United States selling hundreds of billions of dollars worth of military equipment to other Middle Eastern regimes. And that's been going on for decades. So that's the first point Porter made. The second point that Porter made is that the U.S. will not meaningfully contradict the interests and agenda of the state of Israel. And I think on our last episode, we had actually, to Porter's point, the Biden's pick for Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, actually has publicly suggested that the United States should never even publicly criticize Israel. Israel's done some shady fucking shit. Like first of all, no country should be immune to criticism, but Israel's also done some really horrible things. Mossad, which is basically the Israeli equivalent of the CIA, is just openly, like, it's openly acknowledged that Mossad assassinates people whenever it wants to, and does so very effectively. And Antony Blinken literally says, "Oh no, we should never publicly criticize Israel." So that's the second point, is that the U.S.'s alliance with Israel is of preeminent importance to the U.S. So as long as Israel has an antagonistic relationship with Iran, the U.S. will also have an antagonistic relationship with Iran. So there was a third thing, but it's not in my notes. Oh, how disappointing. Okay. I think, I see. This was supposed to be indented. Yeah, there's 3 points. So yeah, and I think making Iran out to be this big, awful boogeyman, the U.S. can use that to justify basically whatever it wants to do in the Middle East. So,
and you mentioned here that this isn't going to change anytime soon. It doesn't matter who the future president is. I mean, I mention her all the time, but maybe someone with the attitude of Tulsi would have the attitude to want to pull out of these of the Middle East and of these stupid wars, but I feel like even she would be hard pressed to do it. Joe Biden doesn't want to. Just so
he's saying that he wants to, and the media is portraying him as though he wants to. Yeah. He has publicly said that he wants to return the U.S. to the JCPOA, and what I think, maybe this is cynical, but the narrative that we're hearing about the assassination of Fakhrizadeh is that basically this is just the Trump throwing a Molotov cocktail at Biden's plans to normalize relations with Iran. I think that that's probably bullshit. I think that the U.S. knows that Trump in many ways has been a golden goose to them, because they can enact all sorts of they can use Trump as a patsy. So we can, if Trump starts a war with Iran, Biden can portray himself as the reluctant warrior. He can come in and say, I never wanted this war. I wanted peaceful relations with Iran, but now we're already fighting. I have to.
Now we're there. Damn. I guess we'll have to stay there.
And nobody will blame Biden for it. And by extension, most people won't even blame the U.S. government for it. They will blame Trump. Mm-hmm. Maybe Mike Pompeo as well.
Yeah, he'll forever be a scapegoat for many, many, many years to come. But most especially in the next 4 years, with anything that goes wrong, or anything where they're like, Joe, he says So he'll be the reluctant hero for all of it. He'll be like, well, yeah, Trump did this, and I
He'll
wanted to
be the
pull out of
forgetful hero.
the forgetful. Oh my God. Yeah, well, I wanted to do this or I wanted to do that, but Trump made it impossible. So sorry guys. And
I,
and then, he'll
I
have
said we should
dementia
have
and
invaded China years ago. I don't know why we waited this long. Oh, Iran. I mean, I don't support the war. No, no. I want
what were we talking about?
to. Anyway, so Fakhrizadeh. So officially, the U.S. and Israel, neither of them have taken responsibility for the assassination, but it's pretty obvious that one or both of them are responsible. Let me try to zoom in on this little nugget. So right after Fakhrizadeh was, oh my God, I've been sharing my screen this whole time.
Mm-hmm.
I've been sharing my screen this whole time.
You have.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, right after Fakhrizadeh was assassinated, this man, Yassi Melman, who I believe is a member of Mossad. Let me double check that real quick. Oh no, sorry. I'm glad I checked that. He's just a journalist, I guess. But Yassi Mel. There was a member of Mossad whose first name was Yassi, and I had never heard the name before, so it was confusing to me. But right after Fakhrizadeh was assassinated, Yassi said he announced Mohsen Fakhrizadeh has been assassinated in Damavand, east of Tehran. According to reports in Iran, he was head of Iran's secret military program and wanted for many years by Mossad. His death is a major psychological and professional blow for Iran. Donald J. Trump retweeted this right after the assassination. And, maybe I'm reading too far into this, but Max Blumenthal, the founder and editor-in-chief of The Gray Zone, he said that he took this Donald Trump's retweet as an endorsement of the assassination, which I don't think that that's reading too far into it. And I think that that's in line with Trump's past comments and behavior towards Iran.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the way that Iran and Israel are posturing and the history of Iran, sorry, not Iran and Israel, the way Israel and the U.S. are posturing and the history of the U.S. and Israel's treatment towards Iran, it's almost certain that one of them is behind this. And we wouldn't. I do think if the U.S. did it, though, I think the assassination of Qasem Soleimani on January 3rd of this year was a much bigger deal. Soleimani is a much more important figure in Iran than Fakhrizadeh. And not only did the United States accept responsibility for the assassination, Trump fucking went on Twitter and bragged about it. So the fact that the United States isn't taking responsibility for the assassination, especially since Trump is on his way out the door, so he knows he doesn't have to give a shit about what anyone in the media or the Democrats say about it. That tells me that it's probably Israel, because basically the cliche that people say is when Mossad assassinates somebody, you don't get a public statement from Israel about it. Wait, what was it? It was when Mossad assassinates somebody, Israel sends flowers, was the cliche that I had heard. That's what people say. Like, Israel never brags about its assassinations, never takes credit for the assassinations it carries out. It's much more covert and, I don't know, clever, more crafty.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the assassination of Fakhrizadeh is similar to previous assassinations of other scientists in in Iran. Wow, I have too many notes.
We're gonna have to split this one up, Cody. But yeah, it is very similar to the other one, and we can actually jump down there if you want to.
I can't even find it. Other scientists.
Previous assassination of.
It's not Soleimani.
No, it's not.
No. Scientist. Oh yeah. Okay. Cool. Oh right. Okay. Here we are. So, Soleimani was actually, I think, pretty different because he was just killed by a missile being carried by a U.S. drone. But Fakhrizadeh's death is actually very similar to other assassinations of Iranian scientists. So Fakhrizadeh is the latest Iranian scientist to have been assassinated, but there were 4 other Iranian scientists who were murdered between 2010 and 2012, and there was at least one other failed assassination attempt against a 5th scientist. I feel really vulnerable that I'm just screen sharing this whole time.
All your notes out there.
Yeah. The assassinations were covert and targeted. In one case, assassins. This was like some Mission Impossible Ethan Hunt shit. In one case, assassins rode up alongside the scientist's car while he was driving. They threw 2 bombs. I don't know if they like had some sort of adhesive or if they were magnetic. I don't remember. But they stuck 2 bombs to the basically like right by the driver's side door of the car and sped away, and the driver was killed in the blast. So the way that Fakhrizadeh was killed, this kind of targeted ambush where after he's dead, nobody says anything. They're just like, huh, that was weird. That to me seems much more like something that Israel would do. Though, as far as I know, I don't believe that Israel ever took responsibility for the assassinations between 2010 and 2012, but they're widely believed to have been behind it. Even the mainstream media in the United States claims that those assassinations had all the telltale signs of Mossad assassinations.
Mm-hmm. And we're not allowed to say anything bad about Israel, so
no.
That's
so yeah, stuff. So I think what I think is going on is I think that this isn't. I think the United States and Israel are basically trying to poke Iran as many times as possible to get Iran to get Iran to respond back in a loud, aggressive enough way to justify a full-scale war against Iran. I don't have it in my notes, but we know that. I mean, it's being reported to some extent in the mainstream media that right after Fakhrizadeh was assassinated, the United States actually repositioned the USS Nimitz, which I particularly like that name. It's a big Navy vessel. They actually repositioned it to the Persian Gulf. It was doing something over in the Indian Ocean. They claimed it was entirely unrelated, though. But they're preparing for something. They're hoping that Iran will fight back. I don't think at first when Fakhrizadeh was assassinated, I was really concerned. I was texting my family and a lot of my other friends that I think, World War III is right around the corner, basically. But now that I'm starting to learn more about this stuff, another cliche that I discovered as I was learning about all this, also jump in and cut me off anytime you want. I've just been rabbit holing about this shit, and so I'm
learning, Cody.
Okay. The other cliche that I heard about this, and I thought this was fucking fascinating. Professor Morandi said this on an episode of Red Lines, which is one of the series that the Gray Zone publishes. Morandi said that the cliche is that the United States plays American football while Iran plays chess. And looking back through all these events, whether they were perpetrated by the U.S. or by Israel, the way that you see Iran kind of keep its eye on its long-term goals of economic prosperity and independence from the the tyranny of the West, I think that I think that that cliche seems pretty accurate. You know, especially after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, most countries would have started a war over that, or at least a lot of countries would have started a war over that. The United States would have started a war over that. Israel would have started a war over that. Iran did not. It made kind of a symbolic gesture by attacking a U.S. base, but nobody died. Some soldiers got concussions, I guess, but like it was very clearly like a symbolic gesture of like, hey, like, we don't like what you did, just to save face in front of their people. It was not a serious act of military aggression, not commensurate with what the U.S. had done. And so I'm starting to think that maybe what we'll see is Iran just weathering these attacks and hoping that eventually either the U.S. and Israel will kind of grow tired of it, or Iran's relationships with Russia and China will become strong enough that it will become strong enough at the same time that those countries are also becoming stronger at the same time that those countries are becoming more economically viable and more geopolitically influential, that eventually it will not be, the US and Israel will no longer be able to get away with doing shit like this.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting what you noted earlier with how Iran is attempting to basically replace their power with nuclear power, and that's what the motive behind these scientists are, is seems to be more energy and healthcare based. I think you mentioned something about healthcare as well.
The uranium that they've been enriching up to 20%, which the U.S. has tried to use as like a smoking gun. Like obviously they have obviously they have nuclear bomb ambitions, but all of the uranium they were enriching up to 20%. The UN inspectors have consistently found that it was used for medical research. Yeah, to isolate medical isotopes, which I don't know what that means, but
yeah. But to my point, I think you were seeing the U.S. as assassinating these scientists, and perhaps it's to keep them from being able to become an economically viable country, because they're basically all of their economics are riding on oil exports, and they're trying to increase the amount of oil they're able to export by changing the energy to nuclear, which is how you described it, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, exactly.
And so, it seems that like we, whether intentionally or unintentionally, are keeping them from developing their economy to newer, higher levels, right?
I think that's part of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Aaron Mate had made a similar argument in one of the videos that I listened to. I think Russia has commented on this multiple times, different Russian diplomats, including Vladimir Putin. The United States wants a unipolar world where it acts as the chief geopolitical force in the world, and where countries can subserviently negotiate with the United States, but never openly defy it. Any country that openly defies the United States has to be taken down. Even countries that aren't particularly rich in resources, such as Vietnam, if they are openly defiant to the agenda of the United States, they have to be toppled. And I think that that's what we see in Iran. And if Iran actually develops its economy to the point where it is a fully developed, industrialized country, then the U.S. won't be able to push it around anymore. The U.S. will have lost.
Yeah. That's exactly what I'm getting at, basically.
Yeah.
Is that we are basically using them as a we're just jabbing them because we can, right? And we're keeping them from becoming more elevated, like economically, right? So exactly what you're saying, and I think we should go ahead and end there, Cody. If that's okay with you, we can get into Soleimani next time.
Yeah. Do you got to go?
Yeah. So, but I
Oh
think that
yeah,
was
we've been
good.
doing
I
this
think
for
that
like
was,
an hour
that
and
was
a half.
really, really informative. I know this. I mean, this is really important stuff. I mean, this is at the apex of our international relations right now. I mean, this is pretty much at the forefront of our issues, and the timing couldn't be any better with the election. It's so convenient to just say that or it's not convenient to say. It seems that it's giving Biden an excuse for the next 4 years to blame Trump for getting us involved in this stuff.
I'm really, it's funny too. I said earlier that that I'm becoming increasingly optimistic that Iran will have a measured, careful, and relatively harmless response to the assassination of Fakhrizadeh. Uh, I I am somewhat optimistic about that, but at the same time, given that we have the greatest economic catastrophe since the Great Depression, and perhaps greater than the Great Depression, looming right around the corner, massive amounts of foreclosures and evictions right around the corner, and the economic dominoes that are going to fall after that. I I think it makes sense that the United States would try to start a war as quickly as possible, and especially before Biden's inauguration, so that they can scapegoat it on Trump.
Yeah, the United States needs a war, or excuse me, our leaders in Washington need a war pretty soon.
And I
because
think
now is the best time. So
I think the clock's running out. I think that Washington probably knows that there will come a time when, like right now, you and I know that the United States spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, or maybe it's the next 9. I'm not sure. For the longest time, it was the next 10. Right now, if the United States ended up in a war against China, which would happen if the United States went to war with Iran, it would probably escalate to a full war with China and with Russia. Right now, if that happened, the United States could probably win because it has the largest, most technologically advanced, and well-funded army in the history of the world. No other country on Earth comes close. But China's economy is growing so rapidly and so consistently that there will come a time when the United States victory in a battle with China will not be guaranteed. And China is actively challenging the United States supremacy throughout the world. It stopped trading oil with the dollar. And you and I both know the history of the petrodollar. Anyone who challenges the supremacy of the petrodollar, basically for the last 40 or 50 years, has been overthrown. And China's the biggest, baddest country that has ever challenged the petrodollar supremacy. Actually, yeah. China just surpassed the U.S. as the largest importer of oil.
Oh, wow.
So it's a big deal that they stopped. I've seen articles trying to downplay it, but I don't see how that can't be a big deal that China, the world's largest importer of oil, stopped trading oil for the dollar.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's an interesting point moving forward, I would say.
So yeah, I mean, when you look at that in conjunction with the looming depression that the U.S. is almost guaranteed to sink into shortly after Biden takes office, it seems like all of the things that would make you expect the United States to go into a really big war are all coming together. And they have this perfect opportunity to start a huge war under Trump and to scapegoat it on him. Like you can almost see the passages in future government issued history textbooks talking about this rogue radical leader that was elected who started World War III.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then helpless Biden had he just had to keep it up. He just had to keep hammering, and oh my gosh, yeah, it's gonna be. I'm intrigued to see history books in like 30 years, but
oh God, shoot me now.
Even exist. So,
well, all right, we'll call that a night. Everybody, thank you for listening, and we'll probably circle back to this topic pretty soon because we got to get through the next 8 pages of notes I made.
All right.